Amid all this chaos, what's the way out for Sri Lanka, Sri Lankan economy? To help us understand, I've invited to our studio someone who helped establish the Institute of Policy Studies in the early 1990s in Sri Lanka and helped develop the postgraduate economics department of the University of Colombo, and that again in the early 1990s. An economist, 40 years of teaching at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam of the Netherlands, Dr. Nicholas. Thank you very much for joining us here.
Pleasure endeavoring.
You've been voted 20 times the best teacher in Rotterdam. Maybe you can give us some perspective into where we're heading. Yes, there's chaos, a state of anarchy, stability is required in the country, but violence alone and protest alone are not going to take us out of this economic mess that Sri Lanka is at right now. What is the way out? We were talking with the IMF, but what do we do now in this current chaotic situation?
Well, I think it hasn't derailed those talks. I think the talks are going to continue, and I'm fairly confident some conclusion will be reached. My advice to the Sri Lankan government would be, yes, begin negotiations with the IMF. Yes, start on an adjustment program with the IMF. However, I would resist extending our international sovereign bond debt. So if the IMF actually advises us to expand our debt, I would try and avoid that. By going for bilaterals. So there are a number of countries that have expressed interest in supporting us with short-term loans, but we're really after longer-term loans. And this way we should be able to avoid expanding our sovereign bond debt, which is the problem at the moment. In fact, this is the biggest problem that we face.
You say avoid bilaterals. Why?
Not avoid bilaterals, go for bilaterals.
Go for bilaterals,
yes.
Sorry, my bad.
So, you know, we're talking of India, China, Japan, Korea. I mean, we already have loans from these countries, and it's my understanding that they have offered us support, and I'm guessing that if we took up these offers, we could seriously build a package which would help us avoid more international sovereign bond debt. And I think that's the thing that I would recommend.
Our foreign exchange reserves have depleted. We have no dollars in the country basically to sustain the next couple of months or even in the next 2 weeks. At the same time, we need political stability we're talking about. But how do you foresee the future for Sri Lanka as we struggle to make ends meet?
Well, I'm negative and positive. I'm negative because we're actually not looking at something very important that's about to happen. And that is, we are entering a really big global recession. I think we're so concentrated on the domestic problems that we're missing this very large force that's approaching us. And it's going to have a serious impact. Now, I would say that even in our negotiations with the IMF, we should point this out to the IMF, since we can't really afford aggressive deflationary policies if we're going to be hit with a huge deflationary wave from outside. So that should be put on the table and discussed explicitly. That's the negative side. The positive side is, I think, one thing that the protests has done, one thing that the demands that have been made has done, is give us a chance for a fresh start. Because I've noticed that the protesters from all walks are fed up with politicians, and they want a clean slate. You know, so this offers us, at least from my memory, a new start. A start that we've never envisaged before, and something that will allow us to actually embark on a proper development strategy, a proper growth strategy.
A fresh start gives us a lot of hope, but where do we start?
Well, I mean, obviously, we have to start by solving our immediate foreign exchange problems, and there we have to go, while we're discussing with the IMF and maybe with their assistance, go for a bridging loan. In other words, short term, we're going to need some foreign exchange, so that meets the immediate needs. But alongside that, I think, and I've been stressing this, alongside that, what we need to do is tell the world that we're open for business. We, instead of selling ourselves as just a tourist destination, we should start selling ourselves as a production destination. I think this changes the very nature of how the world looks at Sri Lanka and helps us start afresh, start a new strategy.
You work with a lot of international clients, investors and overseas economists. What are their views on Sri Lanka at present? There's no doubt that the confidence, investor confidence on Sri Lanka has eroded. But you also sound positive of a fresh start for the country as we move out of a period where politicians reigned, there were powers, corruption, and now we're looking at a fresh start. So how do we move ahead here?
Well, that's it. It's precisely that endeavor. We can now actually talk about a fresh start. Before, it was empty promises. You know, it's just basically the same old wine in a new bottle. That was it. But now we can genuinely say, look, the people have had enough. They want a fresh start, and they're not prepared to put up with old politicians coming back and essentially doing the same old things, which never took us anywhere. Now we've got a chance to really embark on, well, I've been talking about this for a very long time, an export-oriented industrialization strategy, which will be very different to anything we have done in the past. And it's my view that the political situation will be far more conducive to that than it has been in the past, because the older generation of politicians somehow got entrenched in very different strategies. You know, there was always this emphasis on tourism and foreign remittances and nothing much else, you know.
What thoughts would you like to give us on solving the political crisis in the country right now? We have the president here, no prime minister, no cabinet, the parliament hasn't convened, and while we're talking about the IMF, a bailout, bilateral support to the economic crisis, we need a solution to the political crisis.
Well, now you're in a terrain that I'm not very confident about. However, what I've heard from those who have been talking to me about these things, one of the things that I found very sensible is the idea of a national executive council or committee. Different people are using different terminology. I find that is at least the need of the hour. I mean, it may not be a permanent structure that we would work with, but certainly as an interim structure, I think that offers a lot of hope. Beyond just mentioning a National Executive Council, I don't have the knowledge of the Sri Lankan Constitution to actually talk about how it could be operationalized.
Finally, we have a couple of minutes more to go, but to the young people, I think they're looking at future Sri Lanka, which brings more hope and prosperity after a very difficult time. You spoke of a recession, Dr. Howard, that Sri Lanka cannot avoid. But while doing that, how do we, while mitigating the impact of a recession, there is a crisis that Sri Lanka has had over these past few months, and also effects of economic mismanagement over decades. But with all that, what do we do now to overcome these challenges?
Well, actually, it's what we are precisely doing now. This discussion of a National Executive Council, I think, is a very good starting point. Discussion of, let's say, a new economic strategy that offers far more hope for young people than in the past. these are, for me, very good starts. I'll tell you this, that if we actually go down this path, I, for one, will bring my money here and invest it. And, you know, I'm known by many, many people to say, no, I will not invest in Sri Lanka. So I've been saying this for a very long time now because the governments have not got the strategy right.
What positives do we offer for an investor as you?
Well, actually, it's not really stability, but it's a profits environment. That's what you really offer. And remember, the currency has depreciated massively. I mean, we're going from 200 to nearly 400 against the dollar. Mm-hmm. For foreigners, Sri Lankan labor is phenomenally cheap and makes us very, very competitive with the rest of the world. So if I'm a foreigner, I would look very seriously at Sri Lanka.